Hello, everybody. This is Professor De Angelo again. We're about in our last unit of the Early American History podcasts, and today we're going to be talking about Western expansion, what you probably were taught as manifest destiny, and we're a little bit of overlap of time periods, but basically still in the antebellum time period, and we're going to be looking at the different motivations and outcomes of this period and this movement. Before we get going, I wanted to draw your attention to two American art forms that were very popular at the time period. The top painting by Gatlin chronicling life in the West, and below is George Caleb Bingham's, a member of the Hudson River School as well. And this is a trapping family along the Missouri River. And both of them getting a look at the era of the common man, if you will, and the impact of American settlers and pioneers in our foreign policy and even in domestic policy. So when we have this idea, right, with this tens of thousands of Americans migrating from the East Coast across the Mississippi, what some people refer to as trans-Mississippi America, so they're drawn out there to become farmers and ranchers. Some are going to be motivated by religious beliefs like the Mormons, and others are going to be out there because of the sort of greed of gold, as it were. And so we talk about manifest destiny, and basically it's during the French Revolution, the Spanish colonies in North and Central America experienced a similar situation of self-rule. And so what had happened is during the Napoleonic period, many of the colonies that were held by Spain were basically left to their own devices. So in 1811, Mexico revolted and established itself as an independent nation. And so early on, right, by the 1820s, fur trappers and traders had been going west, right? And traders in the Rocky Mountains, or what some people refer to them as mountain men, would go out there and just cut themselves off from civilization entirely. And so when we talk about manifest destiny, there's a bit of mysticism and I guess you would call it cultural centrism. This idea that the white Protestant American population was destined to control the northern hemisphere of the Americas. And the term is credited as being coined by the journalist John Sullivan. And the idea of a Republican empire that really stretches all the way back to the very beginning. You can actually read these types of references in writings by Jefferson and even Hamilton and John Adams and President Washington. Just multiple people in the time period had believed that America was going to be an empire of republics. And this meant small, self-governed entities. For Jefferson, this idea was really about creating an environment where everybody could be a so-called virtuous farmer. Jefferson believed, like himself, that he was in this self-contained mini paradise, if you will, in Monticello. Set aside the fact that he was heavily in debt, but the fact of the matter is he basically produced everything that he basically needed and felt that he was, in a sense, in his own little fiefdom, which in many ways he was. So this drive west is very strong, almost from the very, very beginning of when we establish roots here in the 1600s. But it's really when we get into the Trans-Mississippian movement that manifest destiny goes into full throttle. And of course, the main stumbling block, at least from the view of Americans, were the Western Indian tribes, or what some people refer to the Indian tribes of the Great Plains. Now, we're going to see a lot of common errors here among the Indian tribes. You may recall that back when we talked about Europeans first contacting Indians on the eastern coast of the United States, we talked about the 3 Ds: disease, disunity, and disposability. And all of these play a role again in this saga. So it's this very tragic replay, if you will. There are some modifications. In terms of disease, Western Indians had already been exposed to many European diseases, and while there still will be epidemics and horrible pandemics among Indians, it's not quite as stark as it was in the initial contact with Europeans. The disunity, however, does prevail. The fighting between the Sioux and the Cheyenne and the Apaches and all these different tribes allowed and permitted white Americans to get in and play sides against each other, weakening all of them at the same time. And then the disposability was almost instant. Americans never really needed Western Indians for survival. We were already, in a sense, acclimated to the environment. And so Western tribes weren't able to enjoy even a small period of when they were seen as allies with the Americans, but instead were always seen as an impediment. So when we talk about the American West, we have to talk about the Spanish West and the idea of Mexican independence. And I touched on that just a minute ago. So when the King of Spain is restored to the throne after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, he's a very weakened king. And the Mexican revolt that had started in 1811 really gets itself manifested. And for the most part, all of the Spanish holdings in the hemisphere go into revolution, referred to collectively as the Bolivarian Revolution after Simón de Bolívar. And these revolts, in many ways, got their aspiration from both the American and then later the French revolutions, the idea that the people should be able to decide. And so Mexico declares itself independent and in 1823 drafts a constitution in which Mexico would not permit slavery. And this was, in many senses of the word, a very heartfelt reality. Obviously, Spanish America had multiple slaves. And I say multiple because there were Indian slaves, there were African slaves. So mestizo culture and all these other different types of levels that were going on. And only by unifying all those people could they get the strength to fight back against the Spanish and other European supporters. And so for Mexicans, it was a natural progression to declare their independence and to also end slavery. And this is a very big contrast to the United States, where we also needed slaves to help us in our struggle. And while many slaves were liberated for their effort in the war, slavery itself was preserved in the U.S. Constitution in 1787. So what this did, however, is it did create a weakened Mexico. And the Rocky Mountains were seen initially as a barrier. And that's because they were such an ominous thing. And yet on the other side of that mountain was Oregon country. Many people had not yet discovered the value of California, although that happens rather quickly. But the richness of the soil in Oregon, which obviously today Oregon would be just a smaller piece. Oregon country back then would be present day Oregon, Idaho, Washington, and part of western Montana, as well as British Columbia. So we're talking about a massive piece of real estate. And it was, in many respects, very rich soil, river systems with plenty of fish, but also trapping, and then, of course, trees, timber. So for us, we had been sharing occupation of Oregon country with the British since the Convention of 1818. And so fur trading, farming, and timber became very lucrative businesses, but also became a form of competition between American aspirations in the area and British aspirations in the area. So both countries encourage individuals, residents, citizens to move west and to try to occupy these lands. America's first quote-unquote millionaire owes his wealth in great part to the Oregon country. Jacob Astor, will go out west and start an enormous fur trading network that culminates in a very big fur trading center at Astoria, which is named after him, of course, which still is there on the West Coast. And he would liquidate that investment and then go into steamboat investments, and then later went into real estate in what is now Fifth Avenue in New York City. So, and the Astor family is still considered some of the oldest money in the United States. So the trails, as you can see here, there were actually multiple ways to get there, but there were these two main, the Santa Fe and the Overland. And then there was what's called the Oregon Trail. Now, what a lot of people don't appreciate is just how hard this journey was. For many people, they could get train and boat travel to St. Louis, Missouri. But then for many, it meant walking to Oregon. And I'm not really sure that Americans fully appreciate what that meant. So after Mexican independence, the new government allowed trade with the United States. And so this created the Santa Fe Trail between the Mexican settlement of Santa Fe and St. Louis, Missouri. This is a 1,000-mile trail that would be and we're talking about very little water and a lot of hostile Indians. And the overland trails, which included the Oregon one, had the same problems. There's a meridian line called the 100th meridian that almost bisects the United States north to south. And when you go west of that line, which is about around the Dakotas, rainfall becomes less certain. And so your access to rivers and all this have become very important. And Indians were not very quick to share those resources. So for those of us on the West Coast, I broadcast these podcasts from San Diego in California, right? It was obviously originally settled by the Spanish. And so these, an attempt to thwart perceived invasions attempts by the Russians, and they had already had established trading posts off the coast of the Pacific Ocean. And so they created these large land tracts called rancheros. And so the Spanish, unlike the British, had a more open, shall we call it, relationship with the Indians. The mestizo culture that we talk about today in Mexican or Latino cultures has to do with the combination of Spanish and Indian families. And so in Spanish America, you do see the sort of a hierarchy based on just how much Spanish or Indian blood that you had in your ancestry. So for the California experience, most of us remember the mission system. So the Spanish government had, from the very beginning, combined its economic endeavors with church enterprises. So this continued right up until the 1820s when the Mexican government took over California. And at that point, the idea of, for lack of a better word, government-sponsored church activity, the support for the missions falls out of practice, and many of these missions are going to go out of existence or struggle. Some will be taken over by private enterprises and turned into farming concerns. But the reestablishment of the missions that we can all go visit today are really the product of really quite recent restoration. So in California, the early development was somewhat stifled. The Mexican regime had very few resources to divert to Mexico. They tried to encourage settlement, but there wasn't really a lot of popular support for it. So outside of remote settlements like Santa Fe and others, San Antonio, there were very few people. It was a sparsely populated area. And so it's also important, I think, to remember that a good chunk of California is, for the most part, a desert. I mean, there's a lot of talk today about how California is struggling because of climate change, but but a great deal of the struggles that we suffer in California are because we have millions of people living in a desert, which, isn't necessarily the way God intended it, if you will. So anyway, the early development of California was rather stifled. And so for Americans, the man that we talk about the most was John Fremont. Now, Kit Carson does play a role. They were both referred to as mountain men. But John Fremont was a rather, I'm going to call him a crafty guy. He not only leads trails, but he's also an officer in the U.S. Army. And what he does is he essentially interferes in turmoil that has already existed in California. A lot of the Californios, the ones who own these vast and massive rancheros, were very frustrated that they weren't getting the kind of help or support from the Mexican government and weren't getting any kind of encouragement for growth. So there was already an existing turmoil against the Mexican government. Fremont and other Americans literally bring troops into Northern California and help to foment a rebellion against Mexico called the Bear Flag Republic, which is why the California state flag is designed the way it is, even though we no longer have those bears present here. So now we shift gears a little bit because we go into Texas. So by the 1830s, Americans had gone in large numbers to settle in this province, which was a Mexican province. And so Mexico had adopted a policy to allow settlers in the area as long as they became Mexican citizens. So your immigration status, if you will, was based on the idea that you would become a full-fledged Mexican citizen. And Stephen Austin becomes the leader of this group. And so, but there's in my opinion, there is a bit of deception that's going on in here. Soon the number of white settlers vastly outnumbered those of Mexicans. And attempts to control immigration and importation of slaves into Mexico angered Americans that were living into these who, at the best, nominally considered themselves Mexican. So, and so this idea of Texas independence becomes somewhat murky, and I do appreciate the fact that if I was teaching this course in Texas, I would probably have different tone and vocabulary. But now what happens, of course, is the Texans start to rebel. And in an effort to put down that rebellion, the president of Mexico, who is Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, decided to lead an army into Texas. And he defeated them in San Antonio at a Spanish mission called the Alamo. This is about 300 Americans and their supporters who are going to be killed there. And now, there's a problem. Santa Anna was not what I would consider to be a very noble or good president. And he makes a very critical strategic error here. He decides as the president of Mexico to lead forces into battle. Now, this sounds very heroic, and yet what happens is just when he thinks he has the Texans defeated, Sam Houston becomes elected as the new commander of the Texas Army. Now, Santa Anna is, in a sense, not keeping his eye on the ball. And at the Battle of San Jacinto in April of 1836, Santa Anna's troops are defeated, and Santa Anna himself is taken prisoner. Now, there's all sorts of folklore that goes with this. If you look at the painting there, of course, you see Davy Crockett, using his now empty rifle as it's sort of like a club to go against the deal there. And this has become folklore. In fact, the rallying cry at San Jacinto was to remember the Alamo. And so what happens, of course, is the captured Santa Anna is forced to sign an agreement that granted Texas independence. Now, the Mexican government is going to renounce that, right? And if I were teaching this class in Mexico, I would be arguing very strongly for this rescission of this independence thing, because it was done under duress, if you will. But my response to that, as a person who's tries to be somewhat balanced here, is that Santa Anna had no business leading his army up there himself. He should have left it to someone else. Then it would have simply have been a defeated army that would have triggered negotiations. The fact that he, the president of Mexico, was captured by the Texans permitted the Texans to negotiate with him directly their own fate, and that is exactly what they did. So once independence was secured, the Texans appealed to Washington for annexation. But at the time, if you remember, Jackson was still the president, but only just. And he had just promoted his vice president, Martin Van Buren, to become president of the United States. And doing so, he basically, Jackson was able to, quote unquote, recognize Texas independence, but there was not the political support for actual annexation. So Texas would thus remain the Lone Star Republic for 9 years. And the Lone Star means that there was only one state in that country. And so people will talk about the amusement park Six Flags, and that's because it was about the Six Flags that flew over Texas, right? There was a French flag, a Spanish flag, a Mexican flag, the American flag, the Texas flag, and so and the Confederate flag. So now you know why that amusement park got its name. So in the United States, then in the heat of this annexation period, in 1841, William Henry Harrison had been elected and died, or I should say inaugurated and died. He gives the longest speech of 2 hours, and he dies in 30 days. And so this left the vice president, John Tyler, as the president. Now, what's unique about this setup, and I'm not too awfully certain you may have remembered, but the Whig Party was made up of both nationalists, called National Republicans or Federalist philosophy, and anti-Federalist philosophies or state rights advocates called anti-Jackson Democrats. Well, Harrison was a National Republican and Tyler was a Democrat. And so when Tyler becomes the president, he goes into open conflict with his own party. Henry Clay, who was really the sort of power behind the throne in the Whig party, was trying to send a number of bills to the president to encourage national unity and a nationalist agenda. But Tyler was having nothing of it and vetoed multiple bills, including a bill to reinstate the Bank of the United States. And so what would happen is, and I'm pretty sure it's the only time in history when the president of the United States was literally kicked out of his own party. And so his entire cabinet resigns except for Secretary of State Daniel Webster. And his rationale at the time, conveniently in my opinion, was that he was in the middle of negotiating with the British over border disputes in Maine and in present-day Minnesota. And many people, I think, and a lot of historians would argue that he was staying because as Secretary of State, he felt that it was a pretty good chance that he would be the next standard bearer for the Whigs going forward. And so the result was what we call the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. In it, the northern tip of Maine's border was settled. And we also settled the borderline between Lake of the Woods and Lake Superior between Canada and the United States. And so for Tyler's administration, he overturned Van Buren's Independent Treasury Act, and then also vetoed the Bank of the United States. And this earned him a lot of indignation from fellow Republicans. And so in 1844, right, in terms of, so in 1844's election, the issue about what exactly should happen with the West and the idea of Texas was really the focal point. And so many people call 1844 the Manifest Destiny election. And so the Whigs are going to go to their standard bearer. Henry Clay will run for the third or the fourth time. I can't remember how many times he actually runs. I think it was 3. And many thought that he was going to be quite the shoo-in. However, being from Kentucky, which was a slave state, Clay was put into a rather delicate situation because if he came out in support of annexing Texas, he would be seen as promoting slavery, where he was, I should say, Clay had established himself as the compromise, I should say the great compromiser. And so he tries to do this little kabuki dance where he sort of is okay with getting Texas, but didn't want to promote slavery. And so he seemed very wishy-washy. The Democrats, on the other hand, went with what we would refer to today as a dark horse candidate. James Polk was sometimes referred to as the Young Hickory. And his program, I should say his platform, was almost all focused on Manifest Destiny issues, about 50% of it. He wanted to annex Texas, and he wanted to incorporate all of Oregon country and California into the United States. And what happens, of course, is that in a very big upset win, Polk was able to overtake even the most noted man in America, Henry Clay. But now, prior to Polk's inauguration, it is actually Tyler who signed annexation, bringing Texas into the Union. And this also was done in a rather weird way. Now, Tyler was a slave owner from Virginia, and he had no qualms with annexing Texas with or without slaves. Now, what he does is he permits I'm going to call it rumor to circulate in the Congress and in the country through the media that Britain was in negotiations with the Republic of Texas for a possible dominion status, meaning that Texas would be independent, it would have its own president and leadership and constitution, but that the British pound and the British military would be integrating Texas into its empire. Now, this would have meant Texas cheap, high-quality cotton being sold without a tariff into Britain's textile industry. For many New England textile owners, this was seen as a direct threat to their competitiveness in the international textile trade. And so they very quickly put down their opposition to slavery and promoted Texas annexation. And the Congress, in very typical spineless fashion, essentially passed a joint resolution, so a non-legally binding expression of the will of the Congress, that the president should have the authority to decide whether Texas gets annexed or not. And Polk went ahead and annexed it. And this is this starts the outrage between the United States and Mexico. And so the Mexicans are going to dispatch troops to the border at the Rio Grande. And so Oregon becomes a interesting territorial issue. We had joint occupation with the British, but the British government was not necessarily interested in going to war over it. So what happened was, and this is my own assessment to be quite honest, is I see a James Polk sitting there looking at two potential enemies, Britain and Mexico. He makes a decision that he's going to offer financial or other incentives to acquire these territories if possible. But he knew that he was probably going to have to go to war with somebody. And I think he made either a conscious or an unconscious decision that he was going to go to war with anybody. It was going to be Mexico and not Britain. And we're really quite fortunate. The British were really more interested in settling than fighting. And so for many Manifest Destiny supporters of Polk, they had started this meme, if we in today's parlance, right? And it was 54-40 or fight. So if you remember way back, John Quincy Adams had negotiated a treaty with the Russians, wherein the southern border of Russian America was settled at 54 degrees 40 minutes. For many Americans, they believed that Oregon should be all ours, all the way up to the very top. And so this chant, if you will, 54-40 or fight, became very prominent. Polk essentially uses the American people in a good cop, bad cop scenario. When the British show a certain amount of intransigence to negotiate, Polk sort of points to American fervor and tells the British that he needs an agreement because the American people were really pushing for war. And so the British, not wanting to do that, instead offered a compromise, in their opinion, which was to extend the 49-degree parallel from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, with the exception of Victoria Island, which would remain under British hands. To many Americans in the North, this was seen as an incredibly lenient agreement with the British. And so a lot of Americans were rather angry about it. But on the whole, Americans were happy that now the United States was truly a continental power, that it stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. Now, Mexico broke relations with the United States for annexing Texas, which it still considered to be a state in rebellion. So Polk, So I'm one of those people who just really believes that the United States did a bit of shenanigans here. So now, the war declaration here comes into play because Polk tries to buy Texas, or excuse me, I'm sorry, buy California. Now, there is the legend, if you will, that Santa Anna had been driven out of power and was in exile in Cuba. And the United States apparently sent money to him with an understanding that when he got back into power, he would accept an American monetary offer for the Mexican cession, as you see in this map. Now, he does take the money. He goes back into power. Polk supposedly sends John Slidell down to the government with an offer of $35 million, I believe it was, for the Mexican cession. And John Slidell is not only not agreed to, but he is not even listened to. He's in fact snubbed and sent away packing, if you will. And so this was one aspect of the antagonism. Now, the other part was, and you can sort of see it here, is that there was a border dispute. The Mexican government, which in the first place didn't recognize Texas independence, also believed that the borders of Texas were based on the Nueces River, and which empties into present-day Corpus Christi, Texas, and not the Rio Grande. And so the area that you see shaded between Texas and Mexico cession is this area that the United States and Mexico sort of argued over. So what happens is Polk becomes enraged that essentially his bribe is not offered, and he deliberately sends the U.S. Army into that disputed territory that you see there between the Nueces and the Rio Grande under the command of Zachary Taylor. And what happens, of course, is he waits for the Mexicans to respond to this incursion. In other words, a very clear provocation, in my opinion, for the war. So he finally gets his war declaration, but there is opposition to the war. In many ways, Americans love to recite through this whole narrative with this sort of lofty American narrative about how everything went smoothly and we all did the right thing and whatnot. And the fact of the matter is there was considerable opposition to the war, particularly among Northern Whigs, who referred to themselves as the conscious Whigs because they were awake and they knew what was going on, that this was, in their opinion, a war solely for the expansion of slavery. And so two things get proposed in the Congress. The first are the spot resolutions. This is going to be led by a one-term congressman from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. And it's called the spot resolution because it was a request by the House for the president to send a representative to the Congress to show on the map the exact spot where an American troop was attacked and killed on American soil, undisputed American soil, I should add. Obviously, the president never follows through on this. This isn't an act, it's a resolution, so it's not legally binding. But the message was rather clear. In addition, one of the appropriations bills for the war was given what's referred today as the Wilmot Proviso. Wilmot was a Northern Whig from, I believe, Pennsylvania. And he basically attached to the bill, which doesn't succeed, to ensure that any land taken from Mexico must be considered free soil because the Mexican Constitution had already outlawed slavery. And this became a rather contentious issue. So while we like to think that everybody was on board, the fact of the matter is there was quite a bit of contention and quite a bit of opposition to the war. In fact, the the writer Henry David Thoreau does his piece on civil disobedience in a great deal to do with this war, that he refused to pay his property taxes because he believed part of it was going there, and he goes to prison. Now, the preparing for war ended up being rather difficult. The United States was not, as we always are, not prepared for large-scale battle. And in fact, the U.S. Army is going to be vastly outnumbered, in some places 10-1, by the Mexican troops. But the war is pretty straightforward. Now, Fremont's Bear Flag Republic helps. The fact that the Mexican infrastructure is being attacked from multiple places, it hurt them a great deal. Now, in addition to that, we have Commodore Sloat. Now, as you can see on this map, he lands troops, and then what he does is he finds out about this Bear Flag Republic, and he takes materials and troops up there to aid in that uprising and, take care of business, if you will, in that area. And so now, for Zachary Taylor, he fights inland. His major battle is referred to as the Battle of Buena Vista, and it's the first war to be covered by journalists who are going to go and watch battles and then write stories and send them by telegraph back to the East Coast newspapers and West Coast newspapers. And the newspaper reporter observing the Battle of Buena Vista declared it an act of spontaneous combustion. Taylor's troops are pinned down by Mexican forces that were way outnumbered them, but Taylor decided to use his superior equipment and just the amount of firepower that he had, and did a counteroffensive that scared away the Mexican armies and led to his victory there. And then Winfield Scott will give the Marines their song stanza about in the halls of Montezuma. Winfield Scott will land at present-day Veracruz, and following almost exactly the trail that Cortez had used to defeat the Aztecs, Scott's army and Marines marched up and captured Mexico City. And this, of course, is the coup de grace of the Mexican attempts to hold on to their independence. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gave the border of Texas to the Rio Grande, and half of Mexico, really about 50% of its territory, was ceded to the United States. The United States did agree to give Mexico $15 million, which was unusual in the 19th century for the victor to pay the loser. But they also agreed to pay off debts that the Mexican government had with private American citizens, which amounted to approximately $3.25 million. So the tragedy here, of course, is that Mexican citizens were really put through the ringer and suffered imaginably. Their losses were huge. Santa Anna will take a large chunk of that $15 million into his own pocket and leave the country. It's really just the beginning of a long string of corrupt dictators that will govern the Mexican people. For us, the legacy was, was quite a bit. Most of our soldiers died from disease than battle, which was pretty common in the 19th century, unfortunately. The relations with Mexico have never recovered. We've had good relationships with the Mexican government. We've had somewhat bad, but they've never been what they were before this war. This is a permanent souring of relations, in my opinion, with the Mexican government. And this makes life in the border regions somewhat difficult. Now, we get a president out of this. A war hero, Zachary Taylor, will be elected in 1848. And then in 1852, the Whigs will nominate Winfield Scott as their candidate for president. So in a ongoing tradition in the United States, there seems to be always a soft spot in our hearts for military leaders, and an assumption that that military leadership could translate into could somehow translate into political leadership. The biggest war legacy, however, is that the rivalry over slavery is going to erupt again, and this time it's going to be permanent. When the United States accumulates all this land, and I think people forget sometimes what Polk had actually accomplished here. One president, James Polk, who many historians believe is probably the most successful president of American history, secured Texas, but then also added California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, and Arizona, and parts of Colorado. I mean, this is an amazing amount of territory. But the moment the ink is dried on this treaty, there is a fight over where and when slavery can expand into them. And this, of course, is going to be a tragedy for the United States. So this is the sort of synopsis of the period of Western expansion, or what many Americans still refer to as Manifest Destiny. And when we talk next, we're going to go into just how this expansionism draws the American people into a whirlwind of hostile debate that's going to lead to civil war.